Ryan and I both are excited to be joined this morning by author Stuart Reid, who is out with a new book called The Lumumba Plot. We can put it up on the screen here, The Secret History of the CIA and a Cold War Assassination. Fantastic book. Stuart, thank you so much for joining us this morning on Counterpoints.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. We actually teased this segment a little bit in a block that we did about Ryan's reporting on Imran Khan and how U.S. has manipulated situations in other countries for our preferred outcomes in a kind of proxy sense. But maybe if we could just stay at 30,000 feet as we start this conversation. Before we began, you answered a question from Ryan that you spent about 6 years of your life on this book. So you're very intimately familiar with the Lumumba plot, obviously. But for those who aren't, could you just give a brief overview of what the Lumumba plot is, what happened to Lumumba, and what your reporting tells us about how the U.S. sanctioned the operation?
Sure. So Patrice Lumumba was the first prime minister of the country now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When it became independent from Belgium in 1960, he was at the helm as prime minister. And immediately there was a crisis in the country where there was a mutiny, a province seceded, total chaos. And so Lumumba eventually, after knocking on the door of the Americans for help, turns to the Soviets and asks for military aid to help put his country back together. And in the context of the Cold War, this was seen as an unforgivable sin. And so that's when the CIA set in motion this bizarre assassination plot involving poisons that were flown to the Congo that the CIA station chief was supposed to put in the food or toothpaste of Lumumba. That poisoning plot ended up not coming to fruition, but the CIA was involved in a different way. It helped overthrow Lumumba. It helped support the man, Joseph Mobutu, later known as Mobutu Sese Seko, who took power in a military coup and replaced Lumumba. And then, crucially, when Lumumba was sent to his death in January 1961, the CIA station chief on the ground essentially gave a green light for that operation. And on January 17th, 1961, Lumumba was shot dead in the breakaway province of Katanga, executed by a Congolese firing squad commanded by Belgian officers who were answering to the secessionist leaders of that province. But the CIA played a key role in greenlighting Lumumba's transfer to a place where everyone knew he was going to die.
Yeah, and it came after excruciating torture that you detail. And one of the things that struck me about the book was just kind of how little I knew about Patrice Lumumba going into it. Up until practically just before he becomes prime minister, almost, he's an apolitical guy. He is a beer salesman, like one of the most popular beer salesmen in the city, who then kind of actually recruits Mobutu into the push for independence. Mobutu was a journalist who didn't want to become involved in politics, and obviously that. It's such a poignant detail that he would have recruited his friend into politics. Then his friend eventually helps usher his own assassination. Can you talk a little bit about who Lumumba was and why Congo would be in a situation where so many people who were not that involved in politics would come to the forefront as soon as kind of this rapid independence unfolds?
Yeah, so rapid is the key word there. The Belgians did basically no preparation for independence at all. In 1955, there was a Belgian academic who released a plan called the 30-year Plan for the Independence of the Belgian Congo. The idea being that by 1985, Congo would finally be ready for independence. He almost lost his job because this was seen as way too fast and aggressive a plan. Events intervened, and then suddenly in the beginning of 1960, the Belgians realized they had to offload their colony, that this was not a sustainable enterprise. So what that meant is that you got the politicians in power after independence had no experience being politicians because political activity was outlawed. before independence. So Lumumba is, as you mentioned, a beer salesman. He had been a postal clerk working for the colonial administration. And it was in Leopoldville, the capital of the Congo, as a beer salesman that he really dove into politics headfirst and co-founded a political party, the National Congolese Movement. And then in elections, parliamentary elections held in the spring of 1960, his party won the most votes. And that's why he was asked to form a government and become prime minister. And I mean, the key thing about Lumumba that distinguished him was that he was incredibly charismatic. Even his bitterest foes recognized that he really had a way with words. He was also a skilled political organizer, and he was peddling a message that was appealing, which is that the Congo had to be strong, united, and independent, truly independent after independence.
Yeah, and this is a key point because, as we saw with, Arbans in Guatemala or Sukarno in Indonesia, there's this argument, especially coming from the Dulles kind of faction of U.S. foreign policy makers, that these were Soviet satellite states, that, you can't distinguish between a Lumumba and a Castro. Do it at your own peril, essentially. But ideologically, Stuart, there are huge distinctions. And in fact, the hostility from the U.S. May have pushed people kind of closer to the arms of the Soviets, where they may not have ever wanted to go, and in fact definitely didn't want to go. What's the kind of ideological approach that Lumumba was taking to that kind of broader world conflict that certainly wasn't on the minds of his constituents in DRC on a kind of daily basis, but also the sort of question of global communism, or what in an industrial society the right way to run a government is?
One of the things that struck me in my research was how pro-American Lumumba was. So, for instance, he spoke of sending Congolese children to American schools, not Russian schools. He signed a multi-billion-dollar deal with an American entrepreneur to hand over his country's mineral and hydroelectric resources to an American. And when he traveled to Washington, D.C., in July 1960, he even called on the U.S. government to send American troops to the Congo. So none of that would suggest any sort of pro-Soviet orientation. It was only after he got rebuffed by the Americans for help that he, as you said, was driven into the arms of the Soviets and asked for military help. The irony here is that if you read the American cables at the time, the CIA, the State Department cables, it's full of talk about what the Soviets are up to in the Congo. After the Cold War, when the Soviet archives were opened, it turned out there wasn't that much on the Congo in them at all, because the Soviets didn't really care about the country. They viewed it as a faraway place where Moscow was never going to have much influence. It's a heavily Catholic country, not amenable to communism. And in 1960, the Soviet Union was not particularly powerful and didn't have a great ability to project power far abroad. Yet, from the American perspective, they saw Soviet ghosts everywhere. And this is one of the great tragedies of the story, I think, is that Lumumba was fundamentally misread by Washington, and they couldn't understand that he, in fact, wanted to stay neutral in the Cold War and simply wanted help putting his country back together and having his government and country survive.
Yeah, you see so many cases of that around the world where the U.S. firmly believed that the Soviets were, orchestrating, gigantic, insurgencies or political plots within a country, acted on those suspicions by, assassinating people or otherwise taking action, and then only to find out later that either the Soviets were actually, encouraging people, like in Indonesia, not to engage in any type of violence or revolution, saying the conditions weren't right for it, or like you said, just completely ignoring it, like with no sense from the Soviets that they had any entry into Congo. You write at one point that Kasavubu, who was kind of the more radical revolutionary, was at least a little bit more interesting to the Soviets, but even in that case, there wasn't much they could do. And Lumumba winds up as this such a tragic figure because he seemed to really believe the rhetoric that was coming, from the United States about democracy and self-determination, and from the United Nations. And you've got these moments where kind of he's reaching out to the United Nations saying, it's basically like calling the manager, like, hey, here are the values that the world says it upholds. I share those values. I'm trying to implement those values here in Congo. What's going on? Why am I being ousted? So can you talk a little bit about the role of the UN and how this unfolded?
Yeah. So at the height of the crisis, Lumumba desperately calls on the United Nations for help, and the UN orchestrates this massive peacekeeping operation in the Congo. And really a remarkably fast operation. In a matter of days, there are thousands of troops on the ground in Congo, and the UN has never done anything like this before. It's supervised ceasefires and truces, but not been responsible for restoring order to an entire country. Dag Hammarskjöld is the Secretary General of the UN at the time. He responds with alacrity and sets up this peacekeeping mission. But then very quickly, the UN peacekeeping mission doesn't do what Lumumba wants it to do, namely to reintegrate that breakaway province, the province of Katanga, which had announced its secession. So the UN goes into Congo imagining it can be a neutral mediator, but what it discovers pretty quickly is that there are actually important political choices that have to be made where it's going to anger one side or the other. So the UN refuses to go into Katanga at first, and Lumumba's extremely frustrated with this fecklessness on its part. And it's then that he tries the Americans, gets rebuffed, and only after that does he go to the Soviet Union.
And can you talk real quickly about how the U.S. viewed this as a success and what the implications were for its kind of regime change policy over the next half century or more?
Yeah. So in narrow Cold War terms, the anti-Lumumba operations that the CIA was undertaking, funding his enemies, bribing Mobutu to take power, organizing fake street protests against him, and so on. In narrow Cold War terms, this was a success because you got rid of a potentially pro-Soviet leader in Lumumba, never mind that that's an exaggeration, and you installed in his place a supposedly pliant pro-American dictator in Joseph Mobutu, never mind that he turned out to be far less pro-American than American officials hoped. So by that sense, it worked. If you broaden the scope even just a little bit to include, for instance, the plight of the Congolese people, it becomes a failure. You have Mobutu in power for 30 plus years, nourished by American aid nearly to the very end, ran the country into the ground, extraordinarily kleptocratic, repressive, and so on. And his regime's implosion kicked off a massive civil war that killed millions. And also, I would argue you didn't even need to get rid of Lumumba to have a country that was not communist and not pro-Soviet. There's no world in which Lumumba was about to, after having thrown off the Belgian colonial yoke, was going to turn around and allow his country to be dominated by the Soviets. Yet within the CIA, this was viewed as a success. Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief, got promoted for his work in the Congo. He won at least one award for it. And then throughout the rest of the Cold War, as you know, there's this pattern of yet more instances where the CIA is intervening on behalf of a friendly tyrant and against the wishes of the democratic impulse of the broader population. So this was not something that was invented in Congo, but I would argue it was really perfected and most shown as a success, quote unquote, in Congo in 1960 and 1961, and would be a pattern that would continue throughout the rest of the Cold War and arguably to this day.
Yeah, and if people are watching the show out of order, they should go check out the block we did on Imran Khan, because to that point, to this day, there are still sort of strategic approaches that in some ways mirror this. Maybe not exactly, but in some ways. Stuart, do you actually have thoughts on that before we wrap as to how this, you do see that sort of creeping, that mentality continue to sort of privately as we get reporting, but also in some ways it's almost a public stance of the U.S. government in certain cases that this is a mentality that makes sense?
I mean, take the case of Africa today. If you look at U.S. policy on the continent, it's very much security heavy, counterterrorism focused. There's still this idea that the goal should be stability above all else and short-term stability above long-term stability. So you see across the Sahel, for instance, America having sort of supported building up the military institutions in various countries at the expense of civil institutions. So there's that tendency that continues. I think the broader lesson of 1960 and 1961 in the Congo is the danger of paranoia, and that Americans were obsessed with what the Soviets were seemingly up to and invented all sorts of apparitions in their head. And so the lesson is that your geopolitical rival is often not 10 feet tall, perfectly competent. And today you see a lot of hyperventilation about what China and Russia are up to in Africa. But if you actually sort of look at the facts and what's really happening, it becomes less alarming.
If you like books like Devil's Chessboard and Chaos, you will like the Lumumba Plot. Make sure to pick up a copy. I'm sure, Stuart, it makes a great holiday gift as well. Stuart Reid, author of the Lumumba Plot. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.